Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the first of our Faculty Friday conversations at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Xuxing Sam Zhao. Professor Zhao is director of our Center for China-U.S. Cooperation, editor of the Journal of Contemporary China, member of the Board of Governors of the U.S. Committee, the Council for Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific, a research associate at the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research at Harvard University, and an honorary professor at Beijing University, Renmin University, China University of International Relations, Fudan University, and Shanghai Foreign Studies University. Sam is a prolific scholar, author of at least 8 books. Sam, you can correct me if I've missed them. Innumerable articles and commentaries, and indeed one of the world's leading authorities on China and China-U.S. relations. So who better to talk with us today about China, its trajectory, its role in the world, and its relations with the United States. Welcome to Faculty Friday, Sam.
My honor to be part of the first program.
Oh, it's great, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. There's so much to cover, so let's jump in. And so all of you watching know, we'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be a chance to ask your questions. So put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So Sam, you came to the United States more than 30 years ago from China. Obviously, you've observed with great interest all the change that's taken place in that time. For those of us in the audience, for those in our audience who've never been to China, help us understand the enormity of the change that's occurred in those years.
Before I start answering these questions, let me say that I want to thank you, Dean Fritz Mayer, for your leadership to the school in the last 1 year. Also, the school has experienced fundamental, very positive change. And also thank you for putting together these programs like this one, and also to be the first speaker of the inaugural event of this Faculty Friday. On that question, I came to the U.S. in the 1980s when China just came out of the disastrous Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping started the economic reform and opened up. So at that time, China was full of energy to make changes. In fact, before I came to the US, I did not understand how fundamental the change would be. At that time, I was very poor. China was very poor too. But China, everyone was equally poor. Talking about equality at that time was equally poor. So I was not unhappy at that time. I did not know outside world, did not know American or wherever other countries were developed. And but now China has been changed dramatically in the last 40 years. Chinese people have become rich. I mean, they lifted about 600 million people out of poverty. And China has become the second largest economy. But China's inequality has developed dramatically in the last several decades. And some people are happy, but some people are unhappy at this time. So it's a very different China for me at this time. And also at that time, China was underdeveloped, but there were so many opportunities. China just opened up to the outside world. People wanted to become rich first. Deng Xiaoping said the get rich first is glorious. So a lot of people trying to find niches and find opportunities to be entrepreneurial, to get rich, to become rich at that time. And so that's very energetic China at that time. Underdeveloped, but energetic. But now China has been very developed, urbanized. You see the digital economy, everything, and other things even have overtaken the United States. But people has become somehow less, more conservative now. I don't see those opportunities in China. Even people don't think they could exploit those opportunities in China today, people try to go by so-called those stabilized, institutionalized, hierarchical ladders. And other people even want to go work for the government at that time. Third thing I want to say here, what I see difference going back China back and forth is that during that time, although China was authoritarian like today, but Chinese people, especially those intellectuals, were very curious about outside world. They want to explore. Even a lot of things they thought was sensitive or politically incorrect, such as the West liberal ideals. They want to find out what's going on there. How could those be used to make China developed, modernized? In fact, I was one of those so-called democratic activists in the university. I was young at that time, once young, and worked with my fellow classmates and also a lot of friends. We organized a lot of political salons to try to introduce some new ideas from the U.S. and other countries to see how these could help China. And some also ideas were very dangerous. And in fact, quite a few of my friends went to jail. I was almost end up in jail, so I will not be at this Faculty Friday for sure. But those were another difference I see that at that time, the Chinese people were very modest. They were mostly critical of their own government on many problems and many issues. But now I found, went back to my colleagues in China, a lot of them became arrogant and even nationalistic in that context. They point fingers, another problem of China, to foreign countries. In fact, these kind of differences could see so clearly from young people in China. And I gave a talk a few years ago at the University of Washington. A young Chinese student stood up asking me one question, said, Professor Zhao, how do you see the difference between your generation of the Chinese students and my generation of the Chinese students? I told them so clear. First, you have enough money. You brought a lot of US dollars to your university in Washington here to pay tuition. I came with only borrowed $50. Second, you came with a knowledge of the US. You know those movie stars, you know all those kind of artists, everything. Speak good English. I came without knowing anything about US. I was brainwashed about US was backward, China was most advanced. That's North Koreans, like that kind of situation. So when I came, I was shocked. US was so advanced. And not the first time for me to see highway, to see using telephone, everything was first time. So that's very, very different. But following that, the another difference is, because of that, we worked much harder than your young people today. Second difference is that we want to learn as much as possible about US and Western advanced knowledge. You don't have that curiosity. So those are the differences, what I see
amazing.
in China and US.
I'm sure there's so many. I led a trip to China of alumni from Duke University, where I used to teach, and a couple of years ago, and we were in Shanghai, and our guide said we were looking across the river, and she said my family had a rice farm right there in Pudong, across the river now, where there's these enormous skyscrapers, astonishing changes in a very in a generation in China. Well. Let me turn to some of the policy issues here. Obviously China has really risen as you say in terms of its economy. It's risen as a world power, and just at this moment, the U.S., especially now the Trump administration, has really withdrawn from its historic leadership role in international affairs. Some have characterized this as a global leadership vacuum. And I guess the big question on the table is whether China is really prepared to fill that vacuum, and whether we should want that if it is.
There are different views on this question. First question, if China is ready. Obviously, for the Chinese leadership, current Chinese leadership, President Xi Jinping, he's very confident. And he thinks China is coming to the so-called center stage of the world, and China should be prepared. He's called for the preparation to be the global leader, especially now when the U.S. is withdrawing from those leadership. And he has called China to provide Chinese solutions, Chinese wisdoms, and to set the agenda and rules of the international order. He called a lot of things there. And a lot of people in China, Chinese foreign ministry people, and some of the Chinese intellectuals, my colleagues, also agree with him. But there's a different view among some cold-headed Chinese colleagues. For example, a professor at the Renmin University, Shi Yinghong, a lot of people know him well in China, he has constantly arguing that China now is overdrafted, overextended, overreached. And China should not follow the U.S. bad example to exhaust China's resources, as U.S. did after the end of Cold War, especially after September 11. Then to go decline, to derail China's rise. So personally, I think he's right. Some other scholars also agree with that. In addition to the so-called overdraft argument, China does not have the soft power. China even does not accept so-called universal values. China hierarchical value, those kind of 天下, all under heaven, those kind of ideas will not be accepted by Chinese neighbors, and not alone those Western democracies. The second part of the question about do we want it? Depending who you are talking to. Yeah. Of course, in the US, when we talk to those American politicians, even my colleagues here, a lot of colleagues in the US universities, and also Europe, they will tell you, no, how could that happen? China is an authoritarian government, and Chinese values, Chinese domestic politics, if they are extended to the international arena, that will be really subversive and cannot be a rules-based, liberal rule-based international order. That will not be possible for them. But there are some other people if you talk to, they will tell you totally different stories. There is a kind of, I read a lot of this kind of literature in Asia and some other countries about de-Westernization argument. For example, a professor at the Singapore National University, your counterpart, their School of Li Guangyao School of Public Administration, Kisher, Mabubani, I think you must know him, or know about him. He was the senior diplomat in Singapore, was the permanent secretary of Foreign Affairs. He has long argued about the arrival of the Asian century in the 21st century, even China century, he argued that. He's not Chinese, but he argued about that. He published so many books, articles backing that argument, which a lot of big followers of him. This week, he published an article in Financial Times. I think the title you'll find interesting said, "The West should hate Napoleon's advice and let China sleep." That's his title of the article, just published this week. And his argument was that you Westerners, you have awakened China. And then you have to be ready for the consequence. You have so many misperceptions about China, flaws. He argued 3 points. Basically, he argued that those thinking of the authoritarian government, Communist Party argument in the West is not what the Chinese people think. In China, this party, a democratic China is not necessarily good for the West and also for the Chinese people. He made that argument. So what I found that writing these two arguments, I will see the Chinese appeals, Chinese model, Chinese leadership should have appeal to the global South, some countries in the global South, for sure, those authoritarian government, but not accepted by the West. So that's the problem here. We should see the sophistication of the answer here.
Yes. Well, that's a good segue, I suppose, into the whole question of the state of U.S. China relations, which, of course, is the focus of your center and much of your writing. You know, a few years ago, it seemed that we were on a trajectory where we might be partners, imagining that we would together solve climate change or ensure free trade, maintain peace. But after the initial friendship of Mr. Trump and President Xi, the relationship's been pretty bad today, and the rhetoric, both sides, I suppose, pretty negative. How bad is the current relationship now, and why does that matter?
I have been in this country over 35 years, witnessing this relationship. This relationship has been up and down all the time. Never been a very smooth relationship because of so different culture, so different history, so different political systems of these two countries. However, and also, but in last 40 years since normalization of the relationship, it's naturally upward and somehow stable in spite of up and down. I think both US and China and the international community might personally benefit from this relationship for sure during those 40 years. However, this relationship in the last decade, since 2008, 2009, I think that's turning point because of the financial crisis, really damaged the West, and China weathered it much better than many other countries. So the relationship has deteriorated since then. I hate to use that term, but I will say now coming to the tipping point of a Cold War between a rising power and incumbent power. And the confrontation between these two countries now is not on a single issue. It's not one crisis. So-called crisis management does not work at this time because the confrontation has been all fronts. In economic front, we talk about decoupling from Chinese technology, Chinese economy, everything. And China talk about they have a technology self-sufficiency, reliance, everything. From the security front, we can see on South China Sea, on Taiwan, on East China Sea, many those kind of security military fronts. These two countries are also coming to those confrontation issues to the other side as a rival and enemy, even on the ideological front. So so-called the China authoritarian model of governance has been, from Chinese perspective, more superior than the liberal democracies to handle the current economic development, even crisis. The pandemic is a very good example. Chinese people are so proud of their so-called whole nation government, resources, mobilization capacity, everything. So in that context, I think we can use the term emerging Cold War II. And in that context, from academic scholars' perspective, I still remember several years ago when John Mearsheimer from the Chicago University, I met him, when he talked about structural realism, the rising power versus the challenge versus the incumbent power, the structural conflict inevitable. These two countries will come to war. We laughed at him, so simplistic. Yeah. You don't look at domestic variables, you don't look at many other things, just look at structure. But now, this kind of theory has become so popular. For example, Harvard professor Graham Allison, he used the term talking about Thucydides trap, which is just basically the same argument. Yes. That becomes so popular. Everybody talking about Thucydides trap. And power transition theory also becomes so popular about the rising power to replace the incumbent power, be peaceful or violent. Those kind of discussions become so hot, so popular. Even people are talking about a possibility of a hot war between these two largest economies. And then the next question you ask about so what? So what? I think that matters a lot. because what we have seen, this kind of new Cold War, not only is it dangerous for the international peace and security, that's so obvious, but we have seen now in the 21st century, the economy is so interdependent. And also we talk about the digital economy, all those technology standards. We see two standards, two ecosystems of technology now. It's so costly for the world. The two production chain systems, everything. And these are lose-lose. Yeah. No winner in this case. And even the new Cold War, I don't think any country, either of them, could easily win, will be enduring. So on that issue, I would want to give a little bit positive note. That is, these two big powers should still have another shared interest, as you mentioned, the climate change yeah. And the pandemic, and the cross-nation crimes, weapons of mass destruction, all those issues. These two countries have no choice but to yeah. work together.
Yeah. Well, you covered a lot of territory there. And then maybe take a couple of pieces of that. So we think about the possibility of, maybe we're already in some kind of new Cold War. The great fear, of course, is that it becomes hot, that there's actual conflict. And there's a number of touch points there. Obviously, China has become increasingly aggressive about asserting its territorial claims in the South China Sea. At the same time, the U.S. has become increasingly visible and show of force trying to push back at that, and with the support of many of the other countries in the region, obviously. Taiwan is it's a perennial hot button issue. The United States has been, in the last few years, more open about its support to Taiwan. This has triggered more aggressive shows of force in China. Just how dangerous is this situation in terms of the possibility of actual conflict?
I'm increasingly worried, as this is a very important question here, worried about the possibility of the accidents taking place, even not accidents, intentional actions causing war across Taiwan Strait and also in the South China Sea. On the Taiwan Strait issue, I see that I have followed this issue since 1990s and have seen the change of Chinese policy ever since then. China had some kind of peaceful unification in attempt during that time. I think China has given up at this time because they don't think they can have any possibility of peaceful unification for at least two regions. One is Taiwan itself, the political dynamic in Taiwan internally has moved away, far away from agreeing any terms of peaceful unification with China. So they have no choice. Second, international community has increasingly, especially the United States, I should mention that, supportive of Taiwan's positions. In the U.S., for example, in the last several weeks, you can see the U.S. Secretary of Health visit Taiwan, and also for the first time, Under Secretary of State visit Taiwan last week. Yeah. At that time, China sent all those jet across the Taiwan medium nine. They now said there was no medium nine. They crossed that at a time. They did that. And third factor here, I think, is the military balance power has changed dramatically. When China's economic military was weak, they did not have the capacity. Now, Chinese military has catch up to the United States. And China thought they have the ability now to overtake Taiwan in hours, they think. They read all those Chinese publications. And also, they thought even U.S. responded. They don't think if it's smart for U.S. to respond. Even U.S. responded. At China's cost, fighting the war, U.S. may not win. If in the open sea, the U.S. might win. So this is very, very dangerous. You see those kind of talks in the last several months, a year, has been really raised up. In the South China Sea is also very dangerous because China also has a military capacity. The world in the arbitration in 2016, China did not accept that. So for me, the world has moved to, and China was not punished. That's another point for that. So for me, the world is moving back to the 19th century of power politics, the might, max right. And the big power do what they want, and the smaller countries suffer for what they must. This is a very dangerous situation now. I don't know what are the ways out of this at this moment.
To what extent is the danger exacerbated by the domestic politics of the two countries? You alluded to earlier the kind of rise of Chinese nationalism in the U.S. We have a kind of very nationalistic leader, both Xi and Trump in their way, probably playing to a kind of popular sentiment. Does that add to the danger here?
Of course, for Xi Jinping in China, his legitimacy has based upon so-called not only performance, but the nationalistic appeal to defend so-called China core national interests, which include several parts. One of them is sovereignty, national sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And so we had some bad views about the Chinese leadership on those issues, but he's supported strongly by the Chinese, a lot of nationalist netizens and people in China. Even on Hong Kong issue, he's supported by those people. So we have a totally different domestic dynamics in China and other countries. And also in Taiwan, we can see also strong nationalist dynamics too. So it's very dangerous.
Yeah, it's a dangerous moment, isn't it? This rise of nationalism around the world. You know, perhaps connected to that in the economic realm is the Belt and Road Initiative of China. There are other things we could talk about, but I was in China a few years ago at just the time this was getting started, and we were in Beijing, but then we were in Xi'an, which was sort of the start of the Great Silk Road, and you know, fascinating in a way that this is imagined as a modern incarnation of the Great Silk Road and somehow a reassertion of China's central role in the global economy. Very ambitious project, as you've written about. Critics have basically argued this is an effort to, you know, to extend China's power, and surely it is that. It's not foreign aid. But you've also written that you think it's a good deal more difficult to execute than one might think. I think you said that the BRI Belt Road Initiative could become a huge white elephant, leaving an enormous amount of wasted resources along its path. So I'm curious why, when you look at it, you are sort of less than sanguine about the success of the Belt and Road Initiative.
As you said, there are three different views about Belt and Road. Chinese official position is that they are providing great public goods, global public goods, and try to help those developing countries jumping in the China's express trend of economic development. In fact, some people even argue that China is, one of my friends, Gordon, he is a former national chairman of National Intelligence Council in the U.S. He just published last week an article. I was part of that project. He argued that is kind of a universalization of the China's development. And that's one argument. The second argument is kind of China building an anti-Western network and trying to build a China-centered global order. The third view, I think, is my view here, that yes, there are a lot of merits on the One Belt, One Road. For example, they focused on the global connectivity and the infrastructure construction. I think that's very, very right point, because the developing countries are short of those facilities and do not have enough funding, investment, and also know how to do it. So that's very important. If applied wisely, China could help those countries and also help China as a win-win situation. However, in this process, not in already 6 years now, you have not seen those kind of results in those countries so far. And China has faced so many challenges in this process, which have not been resolved. For example, how those underdevelopment of infrastructure in those countries are for reasons. Why? Because a lot of them have a lot of big holes. You cannot fill those big holes simply by putting money there. And you have gradually do that working with those countries, but China has not found those kind of commercially viable projects. Second, here is that kind of a conflict interest between China and those countries. Chinese way of doing things is not nationally accepted by the other countries. And from highway, high-speed railroad in China, they can just smash all those houses, all those land, take them away.
Yeah.
But how can you do that in South Asia? How can you do it in other, even in Central Asia? It's not some Chinese way you can work in those other countries. Another problem here is that the standard. People say, oh, it's a multilateral China network. I don't see that way. It's a multi-bilateral agreements. Over 100 agreements, they're not multilateral. It's one by one, just like Trump's way. It's not building a rule. Fair enough for every country to follow. Another is on the table, another things. It's a lot of problem there. So in, as I said, 6 years already, 2013 up to now, almost 7 years, I would say, by now. It's slow start, very slow start. And so far, 2018, and they had third the Belt Road Global Summit. And Xi Jinping has kind of set back, talking about, oh, we have to rethink about some of these issues. And also the COVID today even put heavier pressure for China to kind of rethink about this program. That's what I see it. Eventually, I think that it could be a white elephant if China does not resolve those problems.
Yeah, well, that's a very helpful perspective on that, because it's easy to imagine. I think a lot of us see this as likely to be successful part of the inevitable rise of China and China's power, but it's perhaps not so inevitable. Let me ask you, turn to a question that, of course, is on the minds of many Americans, which is, and you talked about this earlier, a little bit, the extent to which China has been and is increasingly sophisticated as an authoritarian state, and we can point to all manner of things. I mean, obviously, most recently, the what's happened in Hong Kong, the apparent continued imprisonment of perhaps millions of Uyghurs, near universal surveillance and use of AI to monitor dissent. I mean, some of it in the context of COVID, quite useful, et cetera, et cetera. It's obviously a long way from what we in the West imagined China would look like today in the moments maybe when you were a somewhat activist, when students occupied Tiananmen Square. And from the outside, I mean, it's hard to even frame the question, but it really is a question of, one is in some sense, I guess, how much we should care about that, how concerned we should be about that. But the other piece of that is what, if any, leverage does the U.S. or anyone else who wants to change China have from the outside?
So there's two parts of the question here. Let me start from democracy itself in China. In fact, democracy, the concept of democracy is not Chinese concept. China never had democracy was introduced from the West in the early 20th century. I wrote an article, in fact, a book on the subject about the history of democracy in China. And I unfortunately discovered one thing, that is Chinese way of thinking democracy is very different from the West. Among many ways, one of them is Chinese thinking of democracy is very instrumental. They thought democracy could help economic development. They will use democracy. If democracy could not help economic modernization, just like liberal democracies, Marxism, communism, fascism, all those kind of, they introduce all those Western ideas to China. Whichever can help, they just use that. So in that context, they exploit democracy for many years, even after founding of PRC in the 1989 Tiananmen Square, all those kind of process. And eventually, I think a lot of people gave up. Why? Because Chinese government has performed what I call performance legitimacy. They
Yeah.
produce economic growth, high speed of economic growth for 30 years. That's what Chinese dreamed to have.
Yeah.
If you have this kind of weight, they ask if you want democracy or want to have more food on your table. Most Chinese people will tell you they want to have more food on the table. So this kind of performance legitimacy has been combined with nationalistic legitimacy by the Chinese government. So the Xi Jinping government, since he came to power, he has been very much rely on both. Since economic growth has been slowed down in last decade, in fact, even before Xi Jinping came to office, so he has to focus on some kind of public policy, as we have a public policy school here, public policy issues like poverty reduction, some kind of public health, or not kind of public policy front. And in the meantime, try to appeal the Chinese national pride on many issues. So the support to the Chinese government has increased dramatically in last several years. In fact, there are a lot of polls. I don't trust Chinese polls for sure, but using Western polls, Harvard University, Kennedy School, they just had a poll published last month and focused on those public policy issues and discovered. And the Chinese government, this is a serious poll from 2003 up to this year. And found this kind of increase of the Chinese trust and satisfaction of government has been constantly increased. And especially during the pandemic. And my alma mater, UCSD, they had a poll published in July, and they found during this pandemic, the Chinese trust of Chinese government also roared high, and Chinese dislike America. And Chinese ask a question, they ask a lot of questions. One question is very interesting, ask, give you a choice. Do you want to live in China or foreign country? Most people said they want to live in China, even authoritarian. So this is a very amazing to me. This is a Western service, not a Chinese. Of course, Chinese people have limited information, they have control of all the information is an issue, but they can compare, especially during the pandemic, the miserable situation in the United States, comparing with China now coming back to normal. That's for the Chinese people to see. And the second part of the question, can the U.S. do anything about that? Yes and no. The changes in China in the last 40 years have, to a great extent, because of they see a model. They see a so-called beacon state. That's what Chinese said that in the United States. But U.S. now has got into a lot of problems. I don't think U.S. in this context could help China that much. U.S. have to help U.S. first before they can come to help U.S. And also another point here is that China's changes fundamentally is come internally, not from outside. So when we say performance legitimacy, it's a double-edged sword, because they could help Chinese leadership to raise their legitimacy, but if the performance not doing well, they could become a source of delegitimacy. So which is very dangerous for Chinese government. They are also on the, I don't want to be in the position of Xi Jinping at this time, because it's very dangerous.
You were describing the graph of confidence in government in China over this period, 2003, the president. If you took the U.S. at the same time, we would go like this. And to your point about performance, it's hard for us to expect other places to want to be like us if we don't
reverse the trend.
I want to tell everyone we're going to open up for questions. I see there are a couple of questions now in the Q&A, and I'll turn to those. Let me just very quickly, last question to you, Sam. Ezra Vogel, who we both know a bit, Harvard professor, the Dean of American East Asian Scholars in this country, recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, which he said a number of things, but at heart, he basically decried the simplistic understandings in the West about China and the ways in which that failure to really understand China leads us to very counterproductive rhetoric and policies. So as a scholar of China, as a teacher about China, why is it so important especially to Americans, but elsewhere in the world, that we really learn more about China and that we have a more sophisticated understanding of the dynamics in China?
The Western scholars and also Western politicians' understanding of China has been very limited. In fact, when I came to the United States 30 years ago, I learned a lot from my professors, everything, but also I found in general, the U.S. interests, Americans' interests in non-Western countries have not been that much. Even for our students here, when they study abroad, they want to go to Australia. They want to go to the beach. They want to go to the English-speaking countries. They don't want to learn a Chinese or non-Western language, which are hard. When I came to this country, I was shocked. American evening news talking about world news are most local news. And in China or any other country, you see global news. It's not local news. It's really foreign news, although it's propaganda or whatever, but it's global. It's international, looking at the Western countries and other countries. So U.S. in that context, understanding of non-Western countries have been limited. But in last several decades, I think the world has been characterized by the emergence of non-Western countries. The Western dominance has been somehow maintained, but it's under challenge. When the U.S. has kept some kind of, I would say, that's some people using in the Asian scholarship, that Americans are sleeping. When America is sleeping, other countries are emerging. And for example, there's a new concept now, E7, emerging seven countries of China, India, Russia, Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, and Brazil has really changed the dominant group G7. Their GDP, for example, was only a small fraction of the G7, but they have reached the same level of G7 in 2015. And according to one survey research model, which I don't know if I can trust those models, they will double the size of the G7 by 2040. So these non-Western countries are rising. Yeah. Very important to understand their culture, their history, and their strengths and their weakness in order for US and Western countries to work with them, making right policy decisions. Otherwise, we'll see a lot of misperceptions, a lot of misjudgment, and a lot of conflicts in this world. So on that note, I want to say, maybe US team may not like it, but the Chinese government has invested so much money in last decade in area studies to understand even tiny country. They put money there in order to have one Belt One Road outcome programs. But in the US universities, even top universities, some small countries, I cannot find anyone to speak a language.
No one, yeah.
So we really have to invest, not only in the understanding of China, I think, all the non-Western world, which is big investment, long-term.
You make a great case for that. Let me, well, let's leave it there and let's turn to the audience questions. There are now a few of them here. Let me, and I'll try to get to them. So Dan Dorr asks, how do policies such as those against the Uyghurs hinder acceptance of President Xi Jinping's Chinese values as a world leader and international opinion towards Chinese primacy, both in Asia and in the wider world?
I think this is a very important, very timely question here. Chinese, so-called, they call them minorities, ethnic, nationality minorities, and has been changing in the last decades. I see so clearly. For quite a while, they had affirmative action policies, just like the US did, to buy their hearts. And but did not work. Really did not work because of the market on economic reform really created those disparities economically and another problem, many other problems, and also political leaders in those so-called autonomous regions for their performance evaluation. One of the indicators is the stability, political stability. but they find a lot of problem in this process. So I would say in the last 10 years, in fact, maybe 2 decades, the Chinese position has been increasingly hardened toward those areas in Xinjiang, in Tibet. I met Dalai Lama almost every year. I advised him on the Tibetan side. He's very old now, but he's a very smart guy, tell you the truth. And Chinese position has been very hardened. Since the war on terror started, they have borrowed that concept of the counterinsurgency and terrorists. They define those ethnic demands as terrorist demands. So they use the military and also use the camps, all those kind of instruments, which I think is totally counterproductive. Also at this time, they temporarily maintained political stability, but produced enormous resentments among those nationality minorities in China and condemned by the international community. But from the Chinese side, I really want to see the other side. The Chinese people have largely supported that. Yeah. It's unfortunate. Chinese people are mostly, I would say, racist in the world. You talk about American ethnic, racist, structural racism until you look at China. They are really racist, and they are really discriminated against those people. They support the Chinese government. I'm so amazed. So the world is much more complicated than what we see it from the moral standard we hold. So the issue here, I don't know how we can find a solution at this point, except we put pressures on China from international community, and also we hope some kind of internal changes will happen in China.
It's very complicated, isn't it? And one doesn't realize from outside, but few Americans realize how many different ethnic minorities there are in
56.
China. Yes, it's a very complex.
Han majority. The issue for Chinese government here is a very complicated issue here is that 56 ethnic groups. Han is the largest. It counts about 91% of population. But ethnic minority people is at 9%. Now there's a social identification out of it's not ethnic, scientific. That 9% of them, they hold about 64% of the territory. So that's the complication of this issue here. Larger Han population concentrated in a small land. And those are very vast land occupied by those small number of ethnic groups. For the Chinese people, that's a very big kind of trade-off. You have to really understand their dynamics.
No, it's very helpful actually for understanding things. A different topic, Christopher Winningham, my apologies, asks Dr. Zhao, in your judgment, are there any remaining areas of potential cooperation between the U.S. and China for mitigating, and he asks in a particular context, for mitigating the threat posed by North Korea?
I think there is some shared interest. That's a denuclearization of Korean Peninsula between China and the U.S. Other than these aspects, these two countries have very different interests on the Korean Peninsula because China has been so afraid of American policy of regime change in North Korea, which from Chinese perspective will put the U.S. militarily toward the Chinese border, and also will cause instability, such as refugee people cross the border. So on that issue, these two countries are fighting against each other. Just because of that, China has supported the North Korean regime so far. But Chinese, I think, has not rethinking in the last decade about North Korea, more of asset or liability. Here is a balance trade-off. I think at this time, China has become realized that North Korea is more liability than asset. North Korea has been just kind of from Chinese as the catch number 22. Damn, if you don't support that, damn, you support that. You got a lot of problems. So when China was rethinking this time, I mean, the distance from North Korea for quite a while. They support the UN resolutions to condemn China and North Korean nuclear tests, all those things. Trump came in. He changed the dynamic. He brought Kim Jong-un in to the United States. China is scared. China reached out to North Korea. China is the biggest winner during these last 3 years in North Korea. So they invite North Korea to China, give assistance. Kim Jong-un was so happy to play in the game of two big powers successfully. Now it's calmed down. China also calmed down. So we'll see this kind of dynamic. U.S. and China could work together on a shared interest, but we have to have wisdoms. Have to think strategically here.
Yeah. Several of our colleagues have questions here. I'm going to start Jane Butcher-McCoy asking timely question. How do you see a potential Biden administration being different from a Trump administration when it comes to improving or worsening U.S.-China relations?
The relationship has become increasingly competitive. That's new normal of the relationship. I see the change in the last 40 years. For quite a while, collaboration defined so-called competition. Now, competition has defined cooperation. So it doesn't matter who comes to the White House. They are facing a new normal. They have to learn how to compete with China here. So the competition part will not be changed if Joe Biden comes to office. But how to compete? That's the issue. I think Trump has found the problem of China kind of unleveled playing field. For example, China took advantage of the U.S. Generosity, U.S. open society, took American technology, stealing American technology, and in a kind of on the tariffs, another kind of problems. But Trump had wrong medicine for the problems because he used those kind of very bizarre trade war type things and fighting with China with slogan "America first, America no." I don't think that has been effective so far. I saw a report published last week looking at the trade deficit has increased in the last 3 years. Even this year, they have not reduced trade deficit, has not brought back manufacturers to China. So U.S. has found a much smarter way to compete with China. And another thing here, he competed with China is compete who is the worst person, compete to the bottom. We have to compete to the top to develop our technology and to develop our economy, to improve our political system. So I think that's what Joe Biden could do if he comes to office. Try to use both sticks and carrot. Trump has so far used only one instrument, and also to use diplomacy instead of just kind of fighting trade wars, and also working with U.S. allies, like-minded countries. These countries, now they have come to Trump's, I see a containment line, not because of Trump, because of this threat from China. So U.S. could work with these countries to set rules, norms that is fair for both China and the U.S. So that's what I see the new administration, I hope the administration would do, is to compete smartly.
Yeah, there's the second question about Biden from Guadalupe Alvidrez, which focuses a bit more on the human rights kind of questions. Would you see? So the question is ultimately, do you imagine that Biden administration will be more aggressive with respect to Uyghur human rights, defending Hong Kong, those kinds of issues?
I think the U.S. should hold on the U.S. Principles on the human rights, but I don't know how much U.S. Could do at this time because the U.S. has retreated from international human rights domain. Good example is that the U.S. withdraw from UN Human Rights Council. It's a big, big damage to the human rights in the world. In fact, when U.S. was a member, the European countries worked with U.S. try to promote those human rights U.S. held, which is a civil rights, individual rights. Chinese also government said they also have their own concept of human rights, which is state-centered human rights. It's a development rights first. They have a hierarchy of human rights. Individual rights is the bottom. Right. The development rights and group rights, national rights are above those. And China prevailed. In fact, look at the resolutions passed by UN Human Rights Council in the last several years. All came to China concepts. Even the Hong Kong issue, there is a resolution proposed by 25 European countries and also some democracies to oppose China's security law on Hong Kong. But over 50 countries proposed counter resolution to support China's Hong Kong policy. See, how can U.S. in that context to promote human rights? U.S. really have to do a lot of things on its own side before U.S. could do that. Just do it, but do it also smartly and rightly here.
Let me turn to a question from our colleague Eileen Grable. So she asked, do you think that the AIIB and other Chinese-led financial programs will tilt firmly in the direction of green finance?
That's a very important question, I think, here. AIIB has been at first criticized by many countries, especially the United States. When they founded, I think, 2016, U.S. tried to stop those allies to join that because they thought that China-centered is serving China's foreign policy objective. But that has not been that case because that's very different from One Belt One Road because a lot of European countries joined. And even South Korea and many Asian democracies joined that. That changed entirely the dynamic of the AIIB because China cannot hold veto power. China initial design was with $100 billion contribution. Together, China will contribute over half of them. China would have absolute veto power. Now, with those countries joining in, and one thing is that China has to scale back their voting shares, only 23% now. Unless you have to have overwhelming majority, China has little power. Otherwise, China is just become an international institution. With again here, with those Western countries joining in, those are NGOs, just like those they are domestic countries. They will post their governments on the green, on the clean, on those kind of standards, environmental and climate, all those kind of environmental for the lending. So AIIB in last this kind of even I talked to at the one conference in Washington last year. I talked to a guy. He was the legal counsel, not legal counsel, he's the head of legal team at World Bank. He was invited to be the head of legal team of AIIB, help them to design the whole legal structure. So AIIB has been in that kind of context built to follow the best practice of international development, multilateral international development institutions. So the green part, I think, looking at their recent landings, the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, they have those joint finance, joint lending with AIIB. I'm really impressed. I met with the governor, Jin Liqun. He was a former Chinese central bank official in Beijing. He talked to me, did not speak Chinese. He talked to me in English because he said, we are international institution. We're not a Chinese institution. I was impressed.
Oh, interesting.
I was impressed. He's a Chinese. He did not speak to me in Chinese. So I can see the kind of difference between AIIB from the One Belt One Road. Unfortunately, those kind of good practice of AIIB have not been applied to BRI and One Belt One Road. That's what I try to criticize, tell my colleagues in China. They should do it.
Sam, we are out of time, I'm afraid, but there are other great questions we could direct your way. As everyone can see, Sam could answer a question on any topic about China. Thank you so much, Sam, for talking with me today. Thank you for being a colleague. As everyone can see, we have a real gem in Sam Zhao on the faculty here at the Korbel School. So thank you all in the audience for being with us today. And thank you again, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Bye, everyone.